Now, it may not be entirely fair for me to say that the Catholic Church is the very first origin of apostasy in the Christian Church. After all, prior to Christ even, you had schisms within the Jewish temple. You had the Greeks involved during the time of the Maccabees that invaded the area and had some influence over how things were translated on stuff like the Septuagint. Even during the time of Paul, you can see that the Western churches had some things they added and were being rebuked for, whether it was the Galatians or the Corinthians. All these groups had different ideas on what to include in their church, and they ritualized things that weren't supposed to be rituals. Many of them didn't start out with the core doctrines, and it's a little vague at times if you read through the New Testament on exactly what Paul was teaching, but it's clear that he definitely points back to the Old Testament for even things like the gospel. This is why in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter warns people to not misunderstand Paul. And if you misunderstand Paul and start to add an imagination of what you think he's talking about without having a solid foundation in the Old Testament, then you will go off into the error of the wicked. And this is definitely clear that there had been some confusion among some churches, or at least a desire to put the will of man ahead of the will of God within these churches. You also have to consider the fact that many of the churches that were planted by the apostles were done in areas such as in Greece, where there was hundreds of years a deeply embedded culture of paganism. And some of these things are not easily shaken, even though you have brand new converts to the Christian faith as taught by Christ and the apostles. So all it takes is just a little bit of error, a little bit of leaven to leaven the lump. And over a long period of time, you start to have little errors becoming very wide errors and gross deviation from the core teachings. And not all of the bishops and deacons in all these different locations had all of the letters. They didn't have all of the scriptures. You know, one guy might have the book of Revelation and another guy did not. As a result of this, there was mass confusion. We even see by the writings of Eusebius where he actually tells you which bishops had what book. And this is in his church history that he wrote in the 4th century during the time of Constantine. And even according to Eusebius, he quotes and says at the time that strife had grown so serious, vigorous action was necessary to establish a more religious state. But he could not bring about a settlement between rival god factions. And his advisors warned him that the presbyters' religions were destitute of foundation and needed official stabilization. So it's not a surprise that someone like Constantine, who is the head of an empire that was trying to take over the whole world, would take the opportunity to corral all these groups together into one group and try to dictate and determine what the faith is going to be for the benefit of his empire. And this empire is going to do what's familiar to them and to start to blend the things that they knew under their religious system that were pagan, things that even go way back long before the time of Christ, even back to Babylon. And these systems and part of the political class that controls the empire wanted to perpetuate itself well into the future. And this is what happened in the 4th century. Constantine never really converted to Christianity during his entire lifetime. It wasn't until his deathbed. And even then, that's when you had the whole idea of the cross come about, where he had a dream of this cross, and that became the symbol of Christianity. So the cross is actually from paganism. It's the cross of Tammuz. And this goes back to the religion of Babylon. And it's the same religion that's been passed around all throughout Europe. that even forms many of the traditions that we have today, and was definitely present during the early formation of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church would want to tell you that they go all the way back to Peter, and Peter was the first pope. And according to history, that's just a damnable lie. There is no apostolic succession between the apostles and the Catholic Church in principle and in scripture, in terms of what the doctrines that were being taught by the apostles up to the Catholic Church. You see different writings like St. Ignatius, and there's different scholars that have researched this quite in depth. Guys like Dr. Philip Schaff that in the late 19th century wrote a book and talked about how he suspected all of the writings of St. Ignatius were forgeries. Now, we know that guys like Eusebius had different references to St. Ignatius. So St. Ignatius was a real person. But the writings that are out there that seem to heavily lean Catholic in Catholic doctrine, that were doctrines formed only from the 4th century onward, and influenced by Constantine. These earlier writings are forgeries. But we also know that the same St. Ignatius was captured by Rome, thrown into the Colosseum to be eaten by lions and tigers. I mean, how convenient. But we do find other early church writings that do seem to align with Scripture pretty well, like the Recognitions of Clement or the Epistle of Barnabas. Things like that do seem to align better. But the further you get towards the 4th century, the worse and more Catholic the doctrine becomes. There's several interesting books that I was looking at and I've seen. Here's one that has some interesting quotes. So this was written in 1916. It's by a guy named Henry Tishner. Now, I don't think he's necessarily a Christian, but he does point out some things that are useful in terms of understanding that early church development. He calls for the need for a new religion, not something that's based on just the whim of man, but, actually conforms to the will of God. And he says, "The prophet of Christendom is not the gentle Jesus. Neither is the gospel of brotherhood and peace the Christian creed. The prophet of Christendom is the Emperor Constantine. And the Christian creed is the decision of the First Council of Nicaea. This council, held under the auspices and authority of Constantine, repudiated the human Joshua and created in his stead the mythical Christ. It changed the day of worship from the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday, to the pagan Sunday. It decreed the doctrine of eternal torture. It ordained the holy days and ceremonies and sacred rites and festivals, all in accordance with Roman mythology. It gave us the Trinity, the three gods in one. It gathered together the legends and fables, and 3 centuries of illiterate holy fathers that had conceived and written from a mass of myths." He goes on to quote a guy named Dean Dudley. And it says, "In regards to the canons and decrees, I think the best time for the Easter festival would have been the ancient honored day of the Jewish Passover. It was opposed merely by a whim of Constantine, because as a Roman he hated the nation, which his country had long detested and persecuted, that is, the Jews. His change in the day of rest arose from the same unjust prejudice. Whether Jesus taught the doctrine of an eternal hell for punishment in the afterlife is a question among doctors of divinity. Origen denied it. The Roman Catholic Church has adopted purgatory in imitation of Sheol, Hades, and Tartarus. That church has many doctrines, forms, and rites similar to those of older religions." Now, Tishner goes on to write about Constantine. Keep in mind, this is the beginning of organized church called the Catholic Church that claims to be Christian. Constantine, he goes on to say, Constantine, like Napoleon, was a warrior. That is, he was a human butcher by profession. He usurped the throne and was proclaimed emperor by his troops in the year 306, while masquerading in the name of Jesus. He killed Maxentius and his 2 sons, who could have been rivals on the throne. He worshipped the old religion and pagan gods. He murdered his wife Fausta while suffocating her in a boiling bath. He murdered his own son Crispus. He murdered Licinius, who married his sister, and her 11-year-old child, and many others of his own blood relation. He had his image stamped on one side of a coin, while on the other side had the image of Elijah, reaching out for the hand of God. His subjects were commanded to stop worshiping Jupiter, Diana, and Apollo, and instead worship Jehovah, Christ, and the Virgin Mary. However, the ignorant masses never knew the difference between their old religion and the new one. The best that could be said of Constantine was that he was insane. Now, it should be pointed out here as well that different groups like the Order of Nuns under the Catholic Church is very similar to Rome's Vestal Virgins. He goes on to explain that the Roman society at that time and up to the fall of the empire was the vilest and most cruel imaginable. Vile and cruel on the part of the aristocracy, and ignorant and slavish on the part of the impoverished masses. Continual wars produced a race of degenerates. Immoralities and crimes against nature that were openly practiced at the feasts of the nobility were considered unprintable. The description that Edward Gibbon, this is a late 1700s writer and church historian, he originally gave these feasts, and the description of them had been expurgated from his works by the American authorities. In other words, his description of these Roman feasts during the time of Constantine could not be put into words that could be published because essentially they were X-rated. None of the educated formed any part of the Holy Fathers chosen by Constantine to sit in the council and formulate the Creed of Christendom. These Holy Fathers were ignorant, drunken, and licentious priests. They were politicians from the lowest type first and priests afterwards, such as the beginning of the Roman Church. Rome enunciated a savage story of God begetting a son by a virgin only to have him slaughtered in a bloody sacrifice to save sinners. And it was to make a binding state religion with its salvation and damnation, its bloody sacrifice of the Messiah and its trinity of deities, to deny which was only blasphemy but treason, and to canonize a so-called New Testament taken from the innumerable Gospels and Epistles that had accumulated during the 3 centuries. That the First Council of Nicaea was convened by the Emperor Constantine. Now, I don't agree with the author on his assessment about the gospel and about the death, burial, and resurrection of the Son. That is confirmed in the Old Testament, so none of that is a fable. However, the way the Catholic Church treated that story and used it to blend into their paganism and used it as a bludgeon on the people is one of the problems of the Catholic Church's approach to creating this organized religion called the Church. That they claim to be Christian. Now he goes on to say, as gleaned from history, it would be a spectacle to even stagger the faith of the most bigoted to view the makeup of proceedings of the First Council of Nicaea. Call to your mind an assemblage of 318 of the most ignorant, illiterate, and cunning ward healers that has ever come to your notice. The Council of Nicaea was far more ignorant and more illiterate and more cunning than these. It was an age so degenerate that it was already fit to plunge itself into the abyss of the Dark Ages. Presiding over these 318 priests sat the coarse, bloated face of Constantine, the murderer. Such was the Council of Nicaea, inspired of God to canonize a holy scripture and proclaim a religion that damns eternal torture to those that deny it. In other words, you're saved by church, or you're condemned by church. He goes on to say the Creed of Constantine, with its trinity of gods and hosts of saints and its rites and ceremonies, its immaculate conceptions, its incense of altars and virgin priests and nuns, all copied after the ancient Roman mythology, naturally appealed to a people reared under paganism. He goes on to quote Isaiah. He says, "Learn to do well, seek justice, relieve the oppressed, help the fatherless, plead for the widow." Isaiah was condemned by the priests and rulers of his day as a rebellious heretic, and was sawn asunder in a hollow tree. His religion was the religion of humanity. After him came the greatest of the Hebrew teachers, the great unknown whose writings are found in the 40th to the 60th chapter of the book of Isaiah. These, as acknowledged by both Jewish and Gentile scholars, were added after Isaiah's death. Such splendid souls do not belong to believe or be damned Christians. They belong to the oppressed and the outraged and robbed of humanity. They have nothing in common with the exploiters and war wolves. Their voices still call in revolt against the creed of Constantine. The purpose of the creed of Constantine is to hold the masses in superstitious servility. There's another book that's interesting called In His Name by Christopher Reyes. And he quotes, "Being the Pontifex Maximus," that is the emperor, the name of the emperor of Rome. And it's the same name, by the way, given to all the popes. Being the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of the pagan cults, the emperor is exceedingly displeased that the pagan faiths do not truly accept him as one of their own. And henceforth, the pompous Emperor Constantine will impose his own version of truth upon his empire. As Tertullian acerbely states, no man can become emperor and remain a Christian. He goes on to say, being in the evolutionary process of rising religion lets the emperor pick and choose which beliefs and rites are to be recognized. Constantine, who treated religious questions solely from a political point of view, assured anonymity by bashing all the Christian bishops who had not signed the new profession of faith. In this way, unity was achieved. It was altogether unheard of that a universal creed should be instituted solely on the authority of the emperor, who was, as a catechism, was not even admitted to the mystery of the Eucharist, and was totally unempowered to rule on the highest mysteries of the faith. Not a single bishop said a single word against this monstrous thing. And he's quoting a guy named Walter Nigg in his book called The Heretics, Heresy Throughout the Ages. He goes on to write regarding even the Mormon faith, and he says, so corrupted does this faith become that even the Mormons recognize it. In 210 AD, there were many churches in the land, yea, there were many churches which professed to know Christ, yet they did deny the most of the parts of the gospel, insomuch that they did receive all manners of wickedness, and did administer that which was sacred unto him, whom it had been forbidden because of unworthiness. And this church did multiply exceedingly because of iniquity, and because of the power of Satan, who did get a hold upon their hearts. Now, the harsh reality, too, is that the Mormon church is sort of a, stepchild baby of the Catholic Church through the Jesuits. And that was formed, and it's a totally fake religion. It's got its own Bible. And its own mystery as to how it was formed, just through one man, Joseph Smith. And it's a totally false religion. And it's something that was created in the 19th century in order to just add confusion to all the many splinter cults based on the Christian faith that existed at the time. You may even notice today that many of the Mormons actually work hand in hand through government. You see people like Mitt Romney, who is a Mormon bishop. And these guys have political clout. Why? Because they're all part of the same club. And it's the same club connected through Freemasonry that's connected through the Catholic Church. The same type of groups that the Catholic Church will deny openly and publicly is the same groups they work secretly behind the scenes. This is all part of the Roman Empire system, thanks to starting out with the guys like Constantine. This is not my opinion. It's not some delusion I came up with. I mean, all these things that I've talked about are well-known things. Quoting other people's writings here. This is their opinions. This is their research. Even the Goldstein letters in 1956 talking about the connection between Mormons and Catholics. It says the Mormons have long been friendly towards the Catholic Church, often saying that if we're not right, then are the Catholics. The friendliness of the Mormons towards the Catholics is attributed to their appreciation that their settlement in Great Salt Lake Valley is due to their connection to Friar Pierre Jane de Smet, the great Jesuit missionary and explorer who met with Brigham Young and helped them purchase land out west. So, there you go. So, of course, you find that their temples have similar architecture and similar details. They have similar handshakes. They have similar imagery and iconography and similar rituals and rites. It's the same thing, just a different flavor, just a different packaging. Now, there's other references, too. We could sit here and pick out books by guys who could possibly be atheists all day long, and, of course, they have a biased view. But what about sources even within the Catholic Church? So we have the Catholic Encyclopedia, Farley edition, volume 14, page 370 to 371, that makes this quote, and it says, "The smooth generalization, which so many historians are content to repeat, that Constantine embraced the Christian religion and subsequently granted official toleration, is contrary to historical fact and should be erased from our literature forever. Simply put, there was no Christian religion at the time of Constantine, and the Church acknowledges that this tale of conversion and baptism are entirely legendary." Here's another one, Catholic Encyclopedia, New Edition, volume 12, page 576, Passam, said Constantine never acquired a solid theological knowledge and depended heavily on his advisors in religious questions. Here's another one. This is from The Life of Constantine, and then a mixture of the Catholic Dictionary, the Addison Arnold edition of 1917. It says, "The presbyters were instructed to bring with them the testimonies they orated to the rabble, bound in leather, for protection during the long journey, and surrender them to Constantine upon the arrival of Nicaea." So they all had different scrolls and things, which Eusebius mentions a number of times, and even cites which bishops had which scrolls, and not all of them matched. Their writings totaled in all 2,231 scrolls and the legendary tales of gods and saviors, together with a record of the doctrines orated by them. Here's one, the Ecclesiastical History from Bishop Louis Dupin from Paris, 1686, volume 1, page 598. It says, "About 4 years prior to chairing the council, Constantine had been initiated into the religious order of Sol Invictus." That's Mithra. One of the two thriving cults that regarded the sun as the one and only supreme god. Because of his sun worship, he instructed Eusebius to convene the first of 3 sittings on the summer solstice, the 21st June of 325. And it was held at the hall in Osius's palace. So in 321, Constantine had initiated a law for having a worship of the sun on Sunday. And he condemned and basically told people they couldn't work on Sunday, but they could work on Saturday. So they were forcing people to attend Sunday worship. And it was for a sun god, a pagan god. So what does the first commandment say? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. This is in direct violation to even the basic 10 commandments. And all the Christian churches still to this day worship on Sunday after the pattern of Constantine, which is a pagan sun god. Keep that in mind. Some other quotes from In His Name by Christopher Reyes. He says, the so-called sacred ancient of Christianity text, now corrupted beyond recognition, serves the purpose which the commanding emperor desired, a faith which is composed of acquiescing followers. The emperor's appointees have performed a job well done. Learned men, so-called correctores, were, following the church meeting at 325 Nicaea, selected by the church authorities to scrutinize the sacred texts and rewrite them in order to correct their meaning in accordance with the views which the church had just sanctioned. Of around 1,800 bishops, only 300 were seen to be fit to attend, and 2 were excommunicated for failing to accept the emperor's approved rulings. But the Arians do not fare well in the council. In other words, they were murdered later after being excommunicated. Christian writers often speak of the first council being of unanimous resolution that all saw the fruit of their triune God and accepted the divinity of Jesus. He has driven out of the city as atheists, because we do not concur in what he publicly preaches, namely, God always, the Son always, as the Father, so the Son. The Son coexists begotten with the Father. He is everlasting. Neither by thought nor by interval does God precede the Son. Always God, always the Son. He is begotten of the unbegotten, the Son of God himself. However, until his preparations for final campaign by 323, Constantine did not abandon his allegiance to the sun god. Even though he regarded himself as a servant of the Christian God, Constantine's public image remained. The sun god was the emperor's companion. The liberation of Rome was attributed to the sun on the medallion struck at the time. I could go on and on. This hopefully gives you an idea of what was going on at the time of Constantine. And by the 360s, you have a different emperor in place that was actually persecuting the Christians once again and persecuting the Hebrews. Canon 29 of the Council of Laodicea in 364, it says, Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on Saturday, but shall work on that day. But the Lord's day they shall especially honor, so that's Sunday. And as being Christians shall, if be possible, do not work on that day. If, however, they are found Judaizing, they shall be cut out from Christ. Some other interesting quotes from famous people. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. The Jesuits are a military organization, not a religious order. Their chief is a general of the army, not the mere father abbot of a monastery. And the aim of this organization is power. Power in its most despotic exercise. Absolute power, universal power, power to control the world by volition of a single man. And at the same time, the greatest, most enormous of abuses. Here's a quote from a Luigi de Sanctis. He's the official censor of the Inquisition. In 1852, he said, all these things caused the Father General of the Jesuits to be feared by the Pope and the sovereigns. A sovereign who is the Jesuits' friend will sooner or later experience their vengeance. How about a quote from Brigadier General Thomas Harris? The favorite policy of the Jesuits is that of assassination. It may be of no coincidence that the United States has had 2 presidents that were assassinated. Mr. Lincoln and Kennedy, and there was mob ties and Catholic ties. How about Adolf Hitler. And this was in a National Socialist publication called Madit. It says, I have learned most of all from the Jesuit order. So far, there has been nothing more imposing on the earth than this hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. A good part of that organization I have transported direct to my own party. The Catholic Church must be held up as an example. I will tell you a secret. I am founding an order. And he's referring to Himmler and the SS. In Himmler, I see our Ignatius de Loyola, who is the founder of the Jesuits. How about John Adams? He says, my history of the Jesuits is not eloquently written, but it is supported by unquestionable authorities, and is very particular and very horrible. The Jesuit order's restoration in 1814 by Pope Pius VII is indeed a step towards darkness, cruelty, and despotism. I do not like the appearance of the Jesuits. If ever there was a body of men who merited eternal damnation on earth and in hell, it is this society of Ignatius de Loyola. And that was written somewhere in the early 1800s. There is another creed that was put out there. Now, it's floating around the internet that it's called Constantine's Creed, and this is simply not the right title for it. And this didn't exist during the time of Nicaea. So this is something that was added much later, even as late as the 1700s, but it can be found in some of the churches, especially the ones in Constantinople. And this one was written in Latin. So there is a copy of it in Latin that you can find in one of the catechisms. But here's what it says in English. It says, I renounce all customs, rites, legalisms, unleavened breads, and sacrifices of lambs of the Hebrews, and of all other feasts of the Hebrews, sacrifices, prayers, aspirations, purifications, sanctifications, and propitiations, and fasts, and new moons and Sabbaths, and superstitions, and hymns, and chants, and observances, and synagogues. Absolutely everything Jewish, every law, rite, and custom, and if afterwards I shall wish to deny the return to Jewish superstition, or shall be found eating with the Jews, or feasting with them, or secretly conversing and condemning the Christian religion instead of openly confuting them and condemning their vain faith, then let the trembling of Cain and the leprosy of Gehazi cleave to me, as well as the legal punishments to which I acknowledge myself liable, and I may be an anathema in the world to come, and may my soul be set down with Satan and with the devils. I don't know if you can tell, but this does not sound like a religion that backs up what the actual Bible says. This is something that's in competition with it and actively denies things that are in it, including Christ himself and what he taught. Christ kept the Sabbath, the apostles kept the Sabbath, and it was on Saturday, not Sunday. You even know this in places outside of Scripture, in places like Roman writers, like the Cassius Dio, and he wrote in his Epitome 65 all about how they conquered Jerusalem and entered into Jerusalem in 70 AD on Saturn's day. That's Saturday. That tells you that that specific day is part of the 7-day observance of the Passover, and that this was even being kept up to the time of the destruction of the temple. And the Jews, of course, do follow this pattern of 7 days, although they have it done at the wrong times. Their new moons and Sabbaths were changed after their time in Babylon in the 5th century BC. So they actually have a polluted Sabbath, which is an evening-to-evening Sabbath, which the Bible even criticizes. But that pattern of 7 days, which was instituted by God in the first week, was even kept by the angels as it explains in the book of Jubilees, has remained a pattern of 7 days uninterrupted by time and by calendar, even to the present day, and will be into the future. Even places like Exodus chapter 31 verse 13 says that the Sabbath is the sign of God's people. And here we have the Catholic Church legally, through government, through power, through force, condemning anything related to that faith proclaimed in the Bible. Yet they claim to be Christian and claim to be able to be the sole interpreters of Scripture. Now, I'm not going to add too much more to this narrative about Constantine at this historical time, other than to point out a few other things to keep in mind on the history of the Catholic Church. Pay attention to the fact that after the 4th century, you had about 1,000 years of the church oppressing the people, extracting large sums of money, building temples to themselves, all those things that the Bible condemns. You have an oppressed and robbed people that are very poor, that are ignorant and slavish, which is the perfect setup for the Catholic priest to rule over them. And then you have a rebellion that happens by the 1500s, where you have the audacity of people like William Tyndale to basically translate the Latin Bible into, which was also in Greek, translate those original texts into English. And the Catholic Church, of course, condemned him for doing this and burned him alive at the stake. You have examples of many years of even popes inventing torture devices used to condemn so-called heretics. You have the institution of the Jesuits. Jesuits, of course, have an influence that have a Chaldean influence behind them, which is Jewish in nature. But you'll see that the higher-ranking Jews from the time of Christ, who were the ones that nailed Christ to the cross, over a period of time worked together with the Romans to maintain their own base of power and their own existence and their own money supply. And they've been working hand in hand with the Romans ever since. And so there's this Chaldean influence over the Roman Empire in addition to all their paganism. And they helped form the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were a military arm that the Catholic Church used to go after and condemn and kill anyone that they deemed to be a heretic. And they were part of the Spanish Inquisition, which persecuted many throughout Europe. Just to give you a taste of the Jesuits, they have something called the extreme oath of the Jesuits, something that they would take once they're inducted into it. And this information came out as the result of an individual in the 1960s named Alberto Rivera, who was also assassinated for revealing these sort of things. He was someone that was actually initiated into the Jesuits and then decided to come out of the Jesuits for different reasons, specifically because it would put him in conflict with the actual teachings of Christ in the Bible, and with God himself. So by his own conscience, he had to leave. But this is what that oath of induction says. It says, I blank now, in the presence of Almighty God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the Blessed Michael the Archangel, and the Blessed Saint John the Baptist, the holy apostles Saint Peter and Saint Paul, and all the saints of sacred hosts of heaven, and to you, my ghostly father, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, founded by Saint Ignatius Loyola, in the pontificate of Paul III, and continued to the present, do by the womb of the Virgin, the matrix of God, and the rod of Jesus Christ, declare and swear that His Holiness the Pope is Christ's vice-regent, and is the true and only head of the Catholic Church or Universal Church throughout the earth, and that by virtue of the keys of binding and loosing given to His Holiness by my Savior Jesus Christ, He has the power to depose heretical kings, princes, states, commonwealths, and governments, all being illegal, without His sacred confirmation, and that they may safely be destroyed. Therefore, to the utmost of my power, I shall and will defend this doctrine of His Holiness, right and custom, against all usurpers of the heretical or Protestant authority whatever, especially of the Lutheran of Germany, Holland and Denmark, Sweden and Norway, and the now pretended authority and churches of England and Scotland, and branches of the same now established in Ireland, and in the continent of America and elsewhere. and all adherents in regards that they may be usurped and are heretical, opposing the Sacred Mother Church of Rome. I do now renounce and disown any allegiance as due to any heretical king, prince, or state, named a Protestant or liberal, or obedience to any of the laws, magistrates, or officers. I do further declare that the doctrine of the churches of England and Scotland and of the Calvinists, the Huguenots, and others of the name Protestants or liberals to be damnable, and they themselves be damned, who will not forsake the same. I do further declare that I will help, assist, and advise all or any of His Holiness's agents in any place wherever I shall be, in Switzerland, Germany, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, England, Ireland, or America, or in any other kingdom or territory. I shall come to and do my utmost to extirpate the heretical Protestants or liberals' doctrines, and to destroy all their pretended powers, regal or otherwise. I do further promise and declare that notwithstanding I am dispensed with to assume my religion heretical, for the propaganda of the Mother Church's interest, to keep secret and private all her agents' counsels from time to time, as they may entrust me, and not to divulge, directly or indirectly, by word, writing, or circumstance whatever, but to execute all that shall be proposed, given in charge, or discovered unto me by you, my ghostly father, or any of this sacred covenant. I do further promise and declare that I will have no opinion or will of my own, or any mental reservation whatsoever, even as a corpse or cadaver, but will unhesitantly obey each and every command that I may receive from my superiors in the militia of the Pope of Jesus Christ, that I may go to any part of the world whithersoever I may be sent, to the frozen regions of the north, the burning sands of the deserts of Africa, or the jungles of India, to the centers of civilization of Europe, or to the wild haunts of the barbarous savages of America, without murmuring or repining, and will be submissive in all things whatsoever communicated to me. I furthermore promise and declare that I will, when opportunities present, to make and wage relentless war, secretly and openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and liberals, as I am directed to do, and extirpate and exterminate them from the face of the whole earth, and that I will spare neither age, sex, or condition, and that I will hang, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs of the wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls, in order to annihilate forever their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poisoned cup and the strangulation cord, the steel of the poniard, and the leaden bullet, regardless of the honor, rank, dignity, or authority of the persons or persons, whatsoever may be their condition of life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed to do by any agent of the Pope or Superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith of the Society of Jesus. In confirmation of which, I do hereby dedicate my life, my soul, and all my corporal powers, and with this dagger, which I now receive, I will subscribe my name written in my own blood, in the testimony thereof, and should I prove false or weaken in my determination, may my brethren and fellow soldiers of the militia of the Pope cut off my hands and feet, and my throat from ear to ear, my belly opened, sulfur burned there within, with all the punishment that can be inflicted upon me on earth, and my soul be tortured by demons in the eternal hell forever. That sounds a lot like Freemasonry, by the way, the oaths and abductions of Freemasonry. All of which I do swear by the Blessed Trinity and the blessed sacraments, which I am now to receive, to perform on my part to keep inviolable, and do all the heavenly and glorious hosts of heaven to witness the blessed sacrament of the Eucharist, and witness the same further with my name written, and with the point of this dagger dipped in my own blood, and sealed in the face of this holy covenant. So this sounds a lot to me like a satanic doctrine and satanic oath. You tell me, does this sound like something Christ would have taught from the Scriptures? So not only does this oath break multiple commandments within the Ten Commandments, the basic fundamental doctrine of God, but it, the Bible condemns anyone that does an oath that's part of the a pagan or Gentile culture. You don't do any of those other than let your yes be yes and your no be no. And they do have vows, like in a marriage vow, that you can see who the responsibilities are of that vow in Numbers chapter 30 and other places. And God takes people's vows very seriously. So he expects people to be honorable in their communication. But here we have a vow that's, you're pledging your allegiance to a man-made authority outside of that of God's dominion and his approval that goes about to break many of his commandments, especially the one that involves his own will, such as he desires mercy, not sacrifice. And this vow specifically calls for sacrifice of anyone that disagrees with the church. And you see how this behavior has happened and perpetuated itself throughout all the governments that the Roman Empire rules over and controls, which is, at today's day and age, pretty much all of them. Even though they have a less obvious and overt role and have taken a step back in the very top levels of all governments, you have the Jesuits still pulling strings. And you can see that all throughout the Middle Ages, the reason that the Puritans came to America and actually had for a time an actual Christian faith that they could actually rule themselves and follow their faith, the way they saw in the Bible. They'd had that for a period of time until the Catholic Church and the Freemasons that were helping them set up what is now known as the United States of America, and you have that 1776 time period where that was established. The Catholic Church then starting to get more active in the United States in the 1840s. And at around the 1820s, you'll see that some of the pagan feasts, like your Christmas and Easters, which were illegal at the time under the Puritans, it took about 100 years, but slowly all of the states started to adopt these pagan traditions. And by like the early 1900 or the early 20th century, you'll see that all of the states now allow for Christmas and Easter, and it became then very commercialized. And you have a huge rise in the Catholic Church, as well as a rise in Freemasonry, and a rise in all sorts of strange things like child abductions and different trafficking going on, and a lot of splinter groups being created and cults, including satanic cults. You see that even during the 3 World Wars, there was a strong Catholic influence. You see things like during the influence of the Nazis. The Catholic Church was right there behind the Nazis, and they were involved in Operation Paperclip to help smuggle Nazis to other parts of the world. The Catholic Church did this. You have Mother Teresa that was involved in trafficking children. You have many genocides all throughout the world. Even Pol Pot. They massacred millions of Cambodians, and the Jesuits were involved in some of this. Even the last Pope, who was a Jesuit, was involved in some of the atrocities down in South America. This is your Catholic Church. This is the church that claims to be Christian. This is your church that claims to represent Christ on earth until his return. And that this is a genocidal state, a transnational criminal organization that is against what the Bible actually teaches. And all your Protestant churches, therefore, since even the time of Martin Luther, have splintered away from Martin Luther, or splintered away from the Catholic Church in name only, seem to still agree with some very basic things from the Bible, yet it's still apostasy based on what they claim it to be. If you aren't too familiar, if you look there's a book that would be very useful to read up on all these things, written by Alexander Hislop in the late 19th century, actually early 20th century. It's called The Two Babylons, and it talks about how the religion of Babylon got spread all throughout the Middle East and was adopted even by the Christian churches, even though it changed names of the Messiah and all the goddesses. It is the same pagan festival. And so instead of having an actual crucifixion that corresponds to the Passover and the actual Bible narrative, what they have instead is a celebration day that is tied to the first Sunday after the new moon. And it has to do with Ishtar or Astera, which is also in the Babylonian myth, the return of Semiramis in her reincarnated form of the spring goddess. And the spring goddess is a fertility goddess. And we have other names for different things regarding this fertility goddess. You know, in Babylon it was called Ishtar, who is a moon goddess, but then the Catholics call her the Queen of Heaven. Well, you read all throughout Jeremiah about the Queen of Heaven, and you can see that it's got a pagan significance. It's something that the people of the time were following, but the Catholics just renamed it and assigned it to the Virgin Mary. Well, you know, the Druids had a Virgo Paratura. Egypt had Isis. The Ephesians had Diana. Etruscans had Nutria. The Germans had Hertha. The Greeks had Aphrodite. And the Romans had Venus. You know, the ancient Jews, like it says in Jeremiah, it's Ashtaroth, the Queen of Heaven. So you have all these the same goddess in the same occult that was spread all the way around the world. People need to be aware that the world is run by an occult. And this occult goes all the way back to Nimrod. And this cult's been in charge. But anytime a paradigm shift happens where the culture wants to impact and change and overthrow their religion and their traditions, well, they just use deception. And they come in and they try to mix things up and make it look like there's a change, but instead they've kept all the same basic traditions. They just renamed them. They repurpose and repackage. That's all this has been. And, you know, why do you think God doesn't want you to do the ways of the heathen? How can the Christian churches actually listen to God and claim they follow God when they ignore all his basic commandments? This is the same, following after these pagan ways is the same sins that got Israel to be removed from the land in the first place. And all the Christian churches then are continuing to go after these pagan ways. You know, then they make excuses for it. Like it says in Jeremiah 7 verse 10, we're delivered to do these abominations. And they just said, well, we Christianized it and we conquered it. You know, the Bible's clear. And you can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and 16, even Jeremiah 10, that we're not to go after the ways of the heathen round about us. We're not to adopt their ways. We're not, God considers it an abomination. But that's what this is. That's why we have a Good Friday. It used to be, you know, an Ishtar Friday. And it involves human sacrifice. It involves orgies. This is part of the occult. This has nothing to do with Christ's actual death, burial, and resurrection. And that's why the math doesn't math.
So in the end of days, after the Great Tribulation, you're going to have that separation of the sheep and the goats and the wheat and the tares. The tares are going to be burned in fire, and the wheat are gathered into the barn. That wheat and the barley, those that are the servants of God, those that will be entering into the new kingdom, they're not going to look like a Catholic or a Protestant. They're not going to look like a Lutheran. They're not going to look like a Baptist. They're not going to look like a Calvinist. There's not going to be divisions in the church. They're going to be one church. Christ is, and God is going to create a new vineyard. He's going to pluck out everything that is false, and he's going to water it his way. He's going to appoint pastors of his own understanding, those that are going to teach covenant his way, that are not going to be subject to the whims of man and the ambitions of man and the interests of powers on earth. That entire timeline of Esau, where he sold his inheritance for a bowl of soup, it's going to be coming to an end at the heel when Jacob comes in and reteaches covenant and rebukes in the gate. and the watchmen rise up. And that's happening now. And the Catholic Church can do all its little dances and twists of this doctrine and that, and they can create all their little narratives all they want, but in the end, they're going to fall. As it's promised in Revelation chapters 17 and 18, the great whore of Babylon will be no more. And many harlot daughters will fall with her, and judgment will be in the house of God. Only a remnant within those churches will be saved, a remnant that decides to come out of her, my people. And they are the ones that will start to listen to God and start to hear him and have their blindness removed from their eyes and unplug their ears. They're going to start to listen and take God's word seriously, and they're going to be in covenant. They're not going to just assume that we can do as thou wilt, which is a satanic doctrine. No, they're going to do it God's way. And it's simple. You keep the 10 commandments, you eat clean, and you fulfill the royal law. But even once those that enter into the new covenant, as it explains in Jeremiah 31, you won't even need to do the royal law because everyone will know God, from the least to the greatest. This idea that the churches have put out there that the new covenant came into place right at the crucifixion time frame. They haven't read the book. They didn't read Hebrews chapter 8 at the end, where it says the old covenant waxes away and is ready to die. But it doesn't say that it did die. It says that it's ready to die because it hasn't died yet. And Christ even said, I want you to go and proclaim my name and my doctrine to the ends of the earth until I return. And that his way includes keeping the Sabbath. And that Sabbath will be part of the doctrine that's written on the heart in the end. So this is what it says. Starting in verse 31, it says, Behold, the days come, saith Jehovah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. This is fulfillment of Ezekiel 37, where the two sticks become one again. That's reforming the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel into a united Israel, the true Israel. This is not the Israel of the Middle East right now. That's just named state of Israel. We're talking about the actual Israel of God that keep his commandments. It says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which that covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, saith Jehovah. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Jehovah. I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Jehovah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, saith Jehovah. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Thus saith Jehovah, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinance of the moon, and the stars by night, which divides the sea, and the waves thereof do roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. And if those ordinances depart from before me, saith Jehovah, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus saith the Lord, if heaven and earth can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off the whole seed of Israel, for all they have done, saith the Lord. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the city shall be built to the Lord from the tower of Hananiel into the gate of the corner. So there won't be temples made by human hands. God will be the one building that temple, and it'll be his measuring line that measures it. And they will all conform to his way, and not the way of man or beast. Praise Yah.